Hello and welcome to You Talking to Me, the Euranet Plus weekly debate. Today we are going to discuss about the Common European Asylum System reform recently announced by the European Commission. According to the Vice President of the Commission, Frans Timmermans, a reform is needed because the refugee crisis has shown that this current system is not working. In order to discuss about this topic, I'm here with two guests. I have here Sophie Magennis. She is head of the Policy and Legal Unit at the UNHCR, the United Nations Refugee Agency, Bureau for Europe. Welcome, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
And he's also here with us, Timothy Kirkhope. He's member of the European Parliament from the European Conservatives and Reformists group, and also a spokesperson for this group on justice issues. Welcome. The Dublin Directive is one of the main points of this reform recently announced. Let's remember, according to this regulation, asylum seekers must ask for asylum in the first country they arrive in, which means a lot of pressure for the frontline countries. In order to reform this regulation, the European Commission has put on the table two possible options. One of these options would be a more ambitious one, meaning moving to a new system which would distribute asylum seekers in the different countries according to different criteria now, criteria like the size of the country or the wealth of the country. And the other option, the less ambitious option, would mean keeping the same principle of the Dublin regulation, but including an emergency mechanism for those specific situations when frontline countries are overwhelmed. So my first question is for both of you, very direct. What would be the best option according to you?
From the UNHCR perspective, what we would like to see is a new arrangement which meets the original aims of the Dublin regulation, which is to make sure that people who are likely in need of protection or who wish to make a protection claim can access those procedures. And if we're left in a situation where the main countries of arrival are left to manage these cases on their own, then we have a situation where people may have a long wait for their application to be looked at, or there mightn't be effective access. So I think we need to look at that, and that's one of the things the Commission has put on the table. And the other is trying to find a way to operationalise solidarity. We talk a lot about solidarity. It's in the Dublin regulation. It's in the Charter of Fundamental Rights. It's in a lot of the political talk. But making it real is quite difficult. So I think the Commission has put forward some ideas about how we might move to a mechanism that operates more on operational solidarity.
But should we go far and look for a new system, or should we keep with Dublin regulation but with a better implementation and so on?
Well, in advance of the Council meeting on the 7th of March, we put out a short paper where we made some suggestions. And what we had suggested at that point was that there needs to be a more holistic approach. And we had suggested that a distribution key would be one way to achieve this. So the idea would be, and it's quite similar to the option 2 that the Commission has on the table, which is perhaps the more ambitious one, is that it would be agreed amongst all of the member states how they could organise a fair distribution of asylum seekers in the European Union. And the suggestion is that would be, from our point of view, a way to make sure that states share solidarity, but also that asylum seekers get access to procedures. Of course, you need a lot of other measures to deal with things like the potential for secondary movement and other issues. But in principle, we think it is a good idea to have an agreement amongst member states about how they will share the solidarity that they have all agreed to, signed up to in the founding treaties for the European Union.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Kirkhope, what would be your position?
No, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, there are a number of issues here. First of all, I see no reason, just because of a failure of Dublin, to reinvent the wheel, to start all over again with some new system. My own view is that the basic principles are right. Not only are they enshrined in the Dublin Agreement, that is that asylum applications should be made in the first safe country that people arrive in when they leave their areas of conflict. That's the first principle, but it's not only enshrined in the Dublin, but it's also enshrined in international agreements of one kind or another over the years. It has always been very much the basis on which asylum has been possible. So I think we should stick with that. I do think we need to put more resources in. Europe must show its solidarity by putting in more resources to help in the hotspots in those frontline states, or indeed beyond it. And I think that's where the UNHCR should come in, really. I was responsible for the UNHCR program that resettled Bosnians when we had the Bosnian conflict. I took the responsibility for the UK's involvement in that. And my own view is that we should be talking also much more about resettlement. Resettlement is something where the United Nations has a particular role. They ought to be dealing with that in conjunction with the European Union from those areas of conflict in the world. And that is where you can get agreement. Countries have shown their willingness to agree to resettlement programs. What they'll never agree to, and it's been obvious in the recent months, they will never agree to a commission-led, obligatory quota system. It is not going to work. And I think that the fact is that we're trying to force this on countries with various penalties and arguments and so on. That is not the answer. The answer is to get as much voluntary support as we possibly can.
But how to ensure European solidarity? You said you are not in favor of quotas or sanctions or mandatory measures. How can we ensure this solidarity? Because nowadays, as was mentioning before, Frans Timmermans said the system is not fair enough and most of the responsibilities in the frontline countries. So how to ensure this shared responsibility?
No, I mean, I think we saw quite clearly when we had previous resettlement programs, again with the UN operating very effectively, we saw a considerable willingness by countries. Indeed, most of the countries of Europe certainly would show much more willingness if it was a resettlement program. What they are not prepared to agree to is an obligation being placed on them when there is no certainty or knowledge or even evidence as to how many people we're actually talking about, a constant flow of migrants.
I would like to just respond and say there's so many points of agreement in what Timothy just mentioned, particularly in terms of resettlement. And we were happy to see that indeed even the title of the Commission's communication refers to legal pathways. So there's a renewed focus now on the need for resettlement, for humanitarian admission, for scholarship programmes. And indeed the United Kingdom has already undertaken to resettle 20,000 refugees over the coming years into the UK. These are really important programmes. We held a high-level meeting a couple of weeks ago that the Secretary-General is going to be following up on, the Secretary-General of the United Nations, and there will be a high-level meeting in September in New York to try and bring this forward. So we need to have many more pledges for resettlement by member states. UNHCR is calling for 10% of Syrians in the region to be resettled. That's over 400,000 people, so it's a significant number, but more needs to be done to assist Syrians in the region. And going even further back from resettlement and legal pathways, I fully agree that we need a renewed focus on conflict resolution and stabilising refugee populations in the countries to which they have first fled. But these are all measures that do not take the place of the need for a system within the European Union to deal with spontaneous arrivals. We need all of these measures in tandem.
I want to go back to legal pathways, but first I would like to include in this debate the media, which are members of Euranet Plus. I would like to listen to the question coming from Italy, from our colleague Gigi Donnelly, working for Radio 24. Please, let's listen to the question.
Hello to you and your audience. Yes, actually, Italy, as you know, is very much worried because very much concerned by what is going on the Mediterranean Sea. And of course, the concern relates very much the fear or suspect in some cases that interests are not shared enough among partners of the European Union. The idea to give a European framework to the asylum and acceptance policies in Europe is very much significant to Rome, as Prime Minister Renzi said several times in the last few days. My question simply is, if you had to give an answer to the Italian public opinion, would you say that Europe and the European Union members are doing all they can to help and to share the dramatic situation in the Mediterranean? Thank you very much.
So our colleague mentioned also the dramatic situation at the Mediterranean Sea. Let's just remember quickly some numbers. Last year, 4,000 people disappeared. This year, already 760, according to the UN. So his question was, are countries doing enough?
Well,
Very quickly, please, because we need to move forward.
Okay, no, I don't think we're doing enough. And I said in my opening remarks that we need to do much more to provide resources to assist those countries that happen to find themselves geographically in the front line. Although this is changing a bit, there are different movements of migrants in different locations around Europe. So it isn't actually a fixed thing. I am the rapporteur on the relocation report. And I've been waiting to produce my report until we sort the Dublin issue out. But I'm also quite interested, before my report comes out, to try and make sure that we have got extra resources available. That's what I think. We have let Italy down, and I think we've let Greece down. I think the answer to this has to be a more united effort to help those countries that are facing this particular problem and have been for some time now.
Let's move to the legal ways to enter Europe. You were mentioning before the communication, the Commission did already mention this, the need of developing these legal pathways to get to Europe in a safe way. However, there are any concrete proposals for the moment on the table. So my question would be, is this arriving too late? Because the UNHCR has been advocating for these kind of measures since a long time ago. And what would be these key measures to be implemented?
Well, I think what we need is more commitments from states to take larger numbers of people, of refugees, through these legal pathways. And there are a range of options that are available. There's the traditional resettlement, which some states are quite conversant with, where refugees are taken from a third country by a state, perhaps in Europe or in America, and they are given refugee status when they arrive, and they are supported to integrate. That's one way. Another is humanitarian admission. People may have seen that the Canadian government very quickly moved into Canada Syrians under a humanitarian admission program, and other countries have such programs. Germany has done them in the past, and other European Union member states have these programs. There are other options, such as student scholarship schemes, and also we've been calling on states to be more open with providing visas for people who may wish to travel for work purposes or study purposes. So there are a range of things that states can do to facilitate access to states in Europe and elsewhere, because this is a global issue that needs to be dealt with globally. And a key issue as well for the European context is family reunification. We do have a directive in the European Union which sets out the entitlements of people who have a protection status in the European Union to be reunified with their family members. But the procedures are really very difficult. They can be different from one member state to the next. It's very difficult for people to apply for family reunification. And we often see people undertaking these dangerous journeys who have an entitlement indeed to come to the European Union under family reunification. So much more needs to be done to unpick these processes, to get member states, UNHCR and EU agencies to work better together to ensure that people who either have an entitlement to be in the European Union or who could be facilitated to arrive in the EU or another state in a safe way, that should be done, and that people aren't left in a position where they know that it will take 2 years or 3 years for this to happen, and then undertake these risky journeys.
I would like to include also in this debate another question from our German partner, the member of Euranet Plus. Let's listen now, please, to the question of Holger Winkelmann from AMS Radio.
Hello, everybody. So in Germany, many people see also the advantages of refugees and asylum. It could be a chance to deal with migration as a way of facing the demographic challenge in Europe, they say. We need to attract talent, Franz Timmermans said, for example, too. So I think Germany is acting in a very intelligent way in this sense. What about the intelligence in this case in the rest of the EU?
So, can migration be an opportunity in order to face a demographic challenge? And could, in this sense, these legal pathways we were talking about could be an option?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think that we've got into such a chaotic situation here that we're no longer, I think, being able to give the right approach to the desirability, the mutual benefit for people who actually we need in Europe to come to Europe, to provide their skills and their help to Europe and the economic growth that we want to see in Europe. And this has been quite a dilemma for a long time now as to getting this balance right and to being able to go back to this arrangement whereby we were looking to encourage people. Unfortunately, the public view now has been completely coloured by this difficulty that we've had with the migration flows that we've seen. And because we haven't had proper controls in place or we haven't been able to deal with the situation, it has in fact made it much more difficult now for us to return to the normal, balanced, sensible migration policies which allow us to reflect the demographic changes and also to have more people coming to Europe to offer their skills to us. And this is, I think, a great shame. We need to get back to that so-called normality, but we need to understand it. I fully agree. We will be lost completely in Europe if we didn't have that option available to us looking ahead for the next 10 or 20 years.
So should the Commission push for these legal pathways in order to face...
Yes, I have no problem as long as we're able to deal with the crisis as well, because we can't use legal pathways as an alternative. This is a slightly different thing. I mentioned the difference between asylum and migration, or immigration, I should say. I was an immigration minister in the UK in the 90s, and we had a sort of policy where we had these two different approaches. One was to give sanctuary, often temporary, but it was sanctuary to people who were escaping terrible areas of the world. And the other side was the immigration itself policy. And I think the EU needs to keep a clear mind and to use that to help us with our demographic changes.
Okay, I'm afraid we are running out of time, and we still have to wait a little bit until the Commission presents the official and concrete proposal. Normally it should be done before the summer, so we will continue for sure talking about this topic. Thanks so much both for being here, and thanks for watching, and see you next week.